Laura sighed as she set down her grocery bags, her shoulders heavy with exhaustion after a long day. The house was silent, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking clock above the stove. The silence that once offered comfort now felt oppressive, a constant reminder of her loneliness even when Mark was home. "Did you get the right yogurt this time?" Mark's voice cut through the quiet, low but sharp. He didn't look up from his phone, barely acknowledging her entrance. The question was laced with a familiar edge, a quiet reproach she'd grown accustomed to but could never quite brush off. "Yes," she answered softly, feeling her face flush. She knew he hadn't asked with genuine curiosity. It was yet another subtle dig, another reminder of her supposed shortcomings. As she moved to unload the groceries, her hand slipped, and a carton of milk tumbled to the floor, splashing across the tiles. Mark's head snapped up, his face contorting with irritation. "Look at you," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "You've become like a clumsy cow." The words hung in the air, sharp and unyielding. She froze, feeling the sting of his insult settle deep inside. The usual brush-off she practiced was harder to summon this time. This wasn't just a careless comment. It felt like the final weight, tipping the scale after years of dismissive remarks, the last straw she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. After a tense pause, she took a shaky breath and continued cleaning the spilled milk. But something shifted within her. The words echoed in her mind, reverberating through memories of every hurtful comment, every look of disdain. She felt anger bubbling up, an unfamiliar sensation that frightened and empowered her. When she went to bed that night, the words wouldn't leave her mind. A clumsy cow. The darkness in the room felt suffocating, pressing down on her as she lay still, her heart heavy. She wondered when exactly she'd become the shadow of herself. She thought back to the early days of their marriage, when he looked at her with admiration rather than disdain, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd lost something invaluable along the way, something she hadn't even noticed slipping away. Morning light seeped through the curtains, soft but unwelcoming. Laura lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with thoughts of last night's argument. Mark had left early, as he often did, barely saying goodbye. Part of her felt relieved by his absence, a fleeting moment of peace that dissipated as soon as she glanced at their wedding photo on the bedside table. The smiles in the picture felt distant, almost foreign. There was a time when she believed those smiles were invincible, that love could withstand anything life threw their way. But now, as she went about her morning routine in the quiet house, she felt as if she were moving through the motions of someone else's life. As she poured coffee into her mug, memories surfaced, unbidden and unwanted. She remembered Mark's earlier criticisms, little barbs disguised as jokes, like the time he'd commented on her weight at a family gathering or dismissed her dreams of returning to school with a condescending chuckle. They'd seemed minor then, but now, pieced together, they formed a heavy weight that she carried in silence. Laura wondered how she had let herself get here, how she'd become a woman who tiptoed around her own home. She realized she couldn't even remember the last time she'd felt truly happy. That simple thought hit her harder than she expected, and for a moment, she considered calling her sister Sarah, someone who had always seen through her attempts to pretend things were fine. Would Sarah even understand? She wondered. Or would she tell me to hold on, to keep trying to fix things? That thought gave her pause, but it was fleeting, brushed aside by the weight of her loneliness. She longed for someone to confide in, someone to acknowledge her pain without judgment. With each step through the day, her thoughts grew heavier, settling like a fog that clouded everything around her. Every sound seemed sharper, every silence deeper, as though the world itself was pressing in on her. She knew she couldn't go on like this, but the idea of change terrified her. The unknown was dark, and she had learned to settle for the familiar, even if it hurt. As the day drew to a close, Laura sat on the edge of her bed, feeling the vast emptiness of her life pressing down on her once more. She closed her eyes and imagined a different life, one where her voice mattered, where she wasn't shrinking into the shadows of her own home. Laura finally worked up the courage to call Sarah. Her fingers trembled as she dialed, but the sound of her sister's warm voice immediately soothed some of her apprehension. They hadn't spoken about anything deeply personal in a while, and Laura knew she couldn't keep pretending. She needed someone to see her pain, to acknowledge the silent suffering she'd been enduring. "Are you okay, Laura?" Sarah's voice held a hint of worry. "No, I don't think I am," Laura replied softly, surprised by her own admission. She began to recount the hurtful words and the long years of quiet anguish. As she spoke, the weight she'd been carrying seemed to lift, piece by piece. Sarah listened patiently, occasionally murmuring in agreement, until Laura finally finished, exhausted but relieved. Her sister's silence stretched for a moment before she finally spoke. "Laura, you deserve more than this," Sarah said, her voice firm. "You've been giving so much of yourself, but at what cost? You're worth more than just being there to please him." Those words hit Laura with unexpected force. No one had ever told her she deserved more. Not Mark, not her friends, not even herself. The idea that she could expect happiness, that she was allowed to want a life where she was respected and valued, felt revolutionary. "What if I can't do it?" Laura whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "What if I don't know who I am outside of this?" "You're stronger than you think," Sarah assured her. "And I'm here, no matter what." They spent the rest of the conversation discussing her fears and dreams. Laura found herself opening up in ways she hadn't done in years, and by the time they said goodbye, she felt lighter, as if Sarah's words had planted a small seed of courage deep within her. Buoyed by her conversation with Sarah, Laura decided to take a few tentative steps toward rediscovering herself. She dug through the attic to find her old art supplies, long buried under years of neglect. She had loved painting once, back when life was filled with more color, and she wondered if she could still feel that same joy. With some trepidation, she set up a small corner in the dining room as her makeshift studio, bringing down her old easel and canvases. Her first brushstrokes were awkward, her hands hesitant as she tried to remember the motions, but soon the act of painting became meditative. The world faded, and all she could focus on was the gentle sweep of color across the canvas. As she worked, memories of her younger self surfaced, back when she had ambition, dreams of pursuing a career as an artist. She'd once planned to go back to school, but marriage and responsibilities had slowly buried those dreams under layers of practicality. Later that week, she ventured out to a nearby park she hadn't visited in years. The air was crisp, and the autumn leaves crunched under her feet as she strolled alone, enjoying the solitude. She took a seat on a park bench and breathed in deeply, feeling a quiet sense of freedom that had long been absent from her life. Watching the leaves dance in the breeze, she felt a flicker of happiness she hadn't felt in years. For the first time, Laura entertained the thought of a life where she didn't have to answer to Mark's every criticism, where she could be herself without the weight of his disapproval. She knew the road ahead was uncertain, but the idea that she could find joy outside of her marriage felt intoxicating, like a quiet rebellion she was finally ready to embrace. Laura's newfound independence began showing in small but powerful ways. She no longer hurried to make dinner on time or scurried to complete tasks that Mark demanded without question. These were subtle acts, small refusals to submit, but they felt like victories. One evening, as Mark criticized her for spending too much time wasting paint on those pointless drawings, she felt a spark of defiance. Instead of apologizing or explaining herself, she looked him squarely in the eye and said, "I enjoy it, and I think that's enough." Mark's face registered a flicker of surprise, but he quickly masked it with a scoff, dismissing her words as trivial. But Laura knew something had changed. She had changed. That single moment of defiance, however small, felt monumental. After that, she continued carving out time for herself, making space for the things she loved. She began listening to her favorite music while cooking, enjoying the small comforts she had once denied herself. The warmth of these simple acts fueled her courage, reinforcing the idea that her happiness mattered. As the days passed, the tension between her and Mark grew. He noticed her changes, and his disapproval became more vocal, but Laura no longer shrank under his scorn. She still felt fear and uncertainty, but now it was mingled with a budding strength that she couldn't ignore. She was beginning to see herself as someone worth fighting for. One bright autumn afternoon, Laura found herself back at the park, savoring the crisp air and the vivid colors of the season. As she wandered near the playground, she noticed a familiar face sitting on a bench, Ben, her old neighbor and childhood friend. They hadn't spoken in years, and she was hesitant at first, but when he looked up and recognized her, his smile was warm and welcoming. They exchanged pleasantries, quickly catching up on the basics of their lives, and Laura felt a sense of ease in his company, a refreshing change from the tension she lived with daily. As they talked, Ben shared stories of his life and recent travels, sparking a curiosity in Laura about the world beyond her small, confining life with Mark. She laughed freely with Ben, feeling herself relax in ways she hadn't in years. Ben noticed the shift in her and gently encouraged her to consider her own happiness. "You know, Laura," he said thoughtfully, "life is too short to spend it being unhappy. You deserve to be at peace." His words echoed the sentiments her sister had shared, and Laura felt them settle into her heart. Spending time with Ben reminded her of who she used to be, someone full of life and ambition, someone who dreamed of adventures beyond her suburban home. As they parted, Ben's simple words lingered in her mind. She felt a renewed sense of hope and validation that her happiness was worth pursuing. Walking home, she realized that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone in this journey as she had thought. The days following her encounter with Ben were filled with restless thoughts and an unshakable sense of possibility. Laura began to see her life through a new lens, one that exposed both her unhappiness and the choices she had been too afraid to consider. One evening, as she prepared dinner, she caught herself staring out the kitchen window, lost in thought. The reflection of her own face, weary and contemplative, stared back at her, and she wondered how long it had been since she'd felt genuinely content. The realization unsettled her, filling her with both sadness and a surprising sense of resolve. When Mark came home that night, he barely acknowledged her presence, absorbed in his phone and muttering criticisms about trivial things. Laura felt her patience thinning, her heart racing, as she weighed the possibilities in her mind. Could she actually leave? Was it even possible? After dinner, she found herself standing in front of her bedroom mirror, imagining a life where she didn't have to constantly defend herself or shrink under his scrutiny. The thought was exhilarating yet terrifying. In that moment, she knew she had reached a decision point. Either she would continue to live in this shadow, or she would take a step toward reclaiming her life. In bed that night, sleep eluded her. The choice was no longer abstract. It was real, pressing, and inevitable. She decided that she would start preparing for the possibility of leaving, even if it meant starting over with nothing. That simple act of acknowledgement filled her with a quiet sense of courage. The next morning, Laura felt the weight of her decision, but rather than dread, she felt a strange sense of empowerment. She knew she had to proceed carefully, to plan her departure without drawing attention from Mark. Over breakfast, she watched him with a new detachment, as though already seeing him as part of her past. She began by making small, discreet changes. She contacted a friend who ran a local art shop and asked about potential part-time work, framing it as a simple inquiry. To her relief, her friend was more than willing to help and offered her a few hours a week to start. With some savings tucked away, Laura began looking for affordable apartments nearby, ones that were modest but safe. The thought of living alone scared her, but the idea of reclaiming her space filled her with anticipation. She started visiting these places during Mark's work hours, careful not to leave any trace of her activities. The secrecy felt thrilling but nerve-wracking. Every small action, calling a landlord, asking about utility bills, planning what little she could take with her, felt like an act of rebellion, a quiet assertion of her right to live freely. Each step brought her closer to the life she had begun to dream of, where she was no longer tethered to someone else's expectations. As her plans took shape, she kept her conversations with Sarah brief but hopeful, avoiding too many details out of fear that her resolve might falter. Sarah sensed the change, offering her constant encouragement without prying. Laura felt strengthened by this silent support, knowing that someone believed in her decision and was ready to stand by her. The evening felt heavier than usual as Laura went through her nightly routine. She had almost everything in place, but she knew that Mark was beginning to notice the subtle changes in her demeanor. She sensed his suspicions simmering beneath the surface, and tonight, it finally erupted. Mark slammed his phone down on the kitchen counter, his eyes narrowing as he looked at her. "What's going on with you lately? You're acting different," he accused, his tone sharper than usual. Laura felt her heart race, but instead of shrinking back, she met his gaze head-on. "I'm not happy, Mark," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "I haven't been happy for a long time," he scoffed, dismissing her words as if they were nothing more than a dramatic exaggeration. "Oh, so now you're blaming me for your problems? Maybe if you actually tried to do something meaningful, you wouldn't feel so miserable." The words stung, but this time they didn't break her. "I've tried, Mark. I've tried for years, but nothing I do ever seems to be good enough for you." Her voice trembled but grew stronger as she spoke, releasing years of pent-up frustration and pain. "I deserve to be happy, too." Mark stared at her, shocked by her defiance. She could see the wheels turning in his mind, searching for ways to manipulate her back into submission. But Laura knew she couldn't let that happen. She was done with the cycle of hurt and guilt. For the first time, she let herself believe that her happiness mattered. "I'm leaving, Mark," she said, each word firm and unyielding. "I've made up my mind." His face contorted in anger, and he launched into a tirade of insults, trying to undermine her resolve. But she stood there, absorbing his words without letting them pierce her. The confrontation was painful, yet liberating. She had spoken her truth, and there was no going back. After the confrontation, Laura found herself needing a refuge. She drove to her sister Sarah's house, her hands still shaking as she recounted the argument to her. Sarah listened patiently, her hand resting on Laura's, offering her unwavering support. "Laura, I'm so proud of you," Sarah said, her voice filled with warmth. "You're finally choosing yourself, and that's not selfish. It's brave." Her sister's validation made Laura's heart swell with gratitude. For the first time, she didn't feel alone in her decision. Sarah's belief in her bolstered her confidence, reminding her that she had people who cared about her well-being. The following day, she received an unexpected call from Ben, who had heard through a mutual friend that she might be moving soon. His voice was kind, his words laced with encouragement. "If you need help with anything, moving, packing, whatever it is, just let me know," he offered sincerely. Laura hesitated but accepted, touched by his offer. Having Ben's support made her feel less isolated, like she was surrounded by people who understood her journey and respected her choices. In a way, these small gestures of support felt like lifelines, guiding her through the turbulent transition. That evening, as she prepared for her next steps, Laura realized how much had changed in just a few days. Her world was beginning to shift, with new sources of strength emerging just when she needed them most. She was no longer facing this journey alone. She had allies, friends, and family who believed in her, and that made all the difference. With each passing day, Laura felt more determined. She finalized the details of her departure quietly, working around Mark's schedule to avoid suspicion. She had secured a small, affordable apartment on the other side of town and arranged to start her new part-time job at the art shop, which would give her just enough income to cover her basic needs. One afternoon, she met with her friend who owned the art shop, and they discussed the hours she'd work and the possibility of teaching a small art class. The idea of sharing her passion with others filled her with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. Her friend's genuine enthusiasm made Laura feel like she could finally embrace this new path. At home, she packed her belongings piece by piece, careful to leave out only the essentials. It was a bittersweet process. Each item she placed in her boxes carried memories, some cherished, others painful. The walls of her home, once familiar, now felt distant, as though they belonged to a life she was finally ready to leave behind. She told Sarah about the move, and her sister offered to help, promising to be there on moving day. Laura's heart warmed at the thought of her sister's steadfast support. Knowing she wouldn't have to face that day alone gave her the strength she needed to keep going. That night, as she surveyed the near-empty bedroom, a profound sense of peace washed over her. She had taken the steps to reclaim her life, and although fear lingered, hope had begun to bloom. For the first time in years, she felt in control of her destiny. Moving day arrived with a mixture of anticipation and sorrow. Laura rose early, her emotions raw but steady, as she packed the last of her belongings. Sarah arrived shortly after, her presence a comforting reminder that she wasn't alone in this monumental step. As they carried boxes to the car, Laura felt the weight of each memory slipping away, replaced by the lightness of new possibilities. Her mind lingered on the empty rooms, each echoing with fragments of her past, a past she was leaving behind to make room for something better. When Mark returned home later, Laura was gone. She left a simple letter on the kitchen table, a final note explaining her decision with clarity and honesty. In it, she wrote of the years they'd shared, of the love that had faded, and of her choice to seek happiness and respect. She didn't expect him to understand, but she hoped he would respect her choice. With the last box loaded, Laura hugged Sarah tightly, the relief and love between them unspoken yet deeply felt. The two sisters shared a moment of quiet understanding, and as they pulled away, Laura felt a newfound sense of freedom settle into her heart. Driving to her new apartment, Laura marveled at the simple pleasure of the open road, the world stretching out before her as she navigated toward her new beginning. She took a deep breath, savoring the freedom she had fought for. This was her life now, a life she had chosen. Her new apartment was modest but filled with potential. As she unpacked, placing each item carefully, she felt herself taking root in this new space. She stood by the window, watching the evening settle over the neighborhood, a quiet sense of peace filling her. She had said her goodbyes, and while there was sadness, there was also relief and hope. She was ready to step forward into the life she had always deserved. Laura spent her first night in the new apartment, surrounded by unpacked boxes and a silence that felt strangely comforting. The reality of her decision began to sink in as she sat by the window, gazing out into the darkened street. She had left behind her old life, but as she looked around, she felt a spark of excitement mixed with uncertainty. This was her space, her beginning. The next few days were a whirlwind of small adjustments. She filled the apartment with her favorite books, set up her art supplies in a corner by the window, and began arranging her furniture just the way she liked. She kept things simple, only keeping what she needed, but each small touch made the place feel more like home. Loneliness crept in, especially at night, when the quiet became too loud and doubts started to surface. She questioned her decision at times, wondering if she had made a terrible mistake, if maybe she'd misjudged herself. Yet each morning, as the sunlight poured through the window and illuminated her new space, the doubts faded a little, and she felt a renewed sense of purpose. At work, Laura settled into her new role at the art shop, greeting customers and even organizing a beginner's art class. The satisfaction she felt from doing something she enjoyed was a balm to her soul. Each interaction, each small success in her work, reminded her of her own value, her ability to contribute and connect with others on her terms. As she navigated this new routine, Laura began to realize that while her life was quieter, it was also filled with a peace she hadn't known in years. She still faced moments of sadness and self-doubt, but with each passing day, those moments became fewer, replaced by a steady, growing confidence. Laura's days gradually took on a rhythm, and with each passing week, she felt her heart lighten. The initial loneliness gave way to a sense of independence, a quiet joy in her newfound freedom. She discovered small joys in her daily life, stopping for coffee at the corner cafe, taking evening walks through her neighborhood, and watching sunsets from her window. Her art class at the shop became a highlight of her week. She found herself deeply engaged in teaching, watching her students' creativity unfold, their enthusiasm rekindling her own love for painting. The satisfaction she felt from sharing her passion was more fulfilling than she had imagined, and each class left her feeling more connected to herself and the people around her. One afternoon, as she was closing up the shop, Ben stopped by, casually mentioning he was in the area. They hadn't spoken much since her move, but he had always been supportive, a quiet presence that reassured her. They chatted easily, their conversation light but sincere, as he asked her how she was adjusting to her new life. "I'm happier than I've been in a long time," Laura admitted, smiling. Saying it out loud felt like another small victory, a confirmation of the peace she had found. Ben's encouragement and genuine interest in her journey reminded Laura of the strength she had gained. She no longer saw herself as the woman who had needed saving, but as someone who had saved herself, one step at a time. As Laura walked back to her apartment that evening, she felt the weight of her past begin to dissolve, replaced by the steady pulse of her new life. She realized that, in all her small, courageous steps, she had built a life that was entirely her own, a life that held both promise and peace. The weeks turned into months, and Laura's life continued to bloom in subtle, fulfilling ways. She had created a rhythm that was uniquely her own, a life filled with simple joys and newfound confidence. She had transformed her apartment into a sanctuary, filling it with art, plants, and books, things that reflected who she truly was. One evening, she found herself reflecting on the journey she had taken. She thought about her old life, the years spent in silence, and the courage it had taken to finally step away. There was no bitterness in her memories, only a deep sense of gratitude for the strength she had found within herself. She had built a new life from the pieces of her past, and that life was something she cherished deeply. Sarah visited often, their relationship stronger than ever. They would share meals, laugh about old memories, and talk about the future. Laura felt an overwhelming sense of love and support from her sister, who had been with her every step of the way. At the art shop, Laura's classes continued to grow, attracting people from all over the neighborhood. The students' laughter and joy reminded her daily of the importance of living fully, of embracing each moment. She felt a sense of purpose that was both fulfilling and sustainable, a reminder that she was capable of so much more than she'd once believed. One afternoon, Ben invited her to a local art exhibit. It was a casual outing, but Laura could sense a warmth between them that had grown over time, a friendship that held hints of something deeper. For now, she enjoyed his company, grateful for the gentle encouragement he'd provided along her journey. She felt no rush to define their relationship, letting it unfold naturally, savoring the present without expectations. That evening, as she walked home, Laura marveled at how far she had come. She was no longer the woman who had doubted herself, who had lived in someone else's shadow. She was free, strong, and deeply at peace with the choices she'd made. As she stood by her window, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Laura felt a quiet contentment settle within her. She had moved forward, not just away from her old life, but toward a life of her own making. She knew there would be more challenges ahead, but she faced them with open arms, ready to embrace whatever came her way. For the first time, she understood that happiness wasn't something given. It was something earned, something she had created for herself. And in that knowledge, she found a profound sense of fulfillment and joy. Hey, everyone. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit that like button. It really helps support us in bringing more meaningful stories to life. We'd also love to hear from you. Tell us in the comments which part of the story had the biggest impact on you. Was it a particular moment, a character's journey, or a theme that resonated? And of course, if you have any ideas for stories you'd like to see on the channel, Leave those suggestions below. We're always excited to create content inspired by our amazing community. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more stories.